Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar from the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients. My name is John Snyder. I serve as the Director of the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients, and I will be presenting today on the topic of the SRTR risk adjustment models. I am joined by my two colleagues, Dr. Andrew Way and Dr. Nicholas Salkowski, who both serve as principal biostatisticians for the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients, and both are responsible for the risk adjustment models that we use to derive the expected outcomes for both the transplant programs and the organ procurement organizations in this country. So we're absolutely excited to bring this educational webinar to you today. I'll just note that these webinars are recorded. They are made available on the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients website and YouTube channel shortly following the webinar, so you will be able to refer back to that video at any future date. And encourage you to go to our website and look under the news and publications section, and there you can find historic webinars that the SRTR has put on various topics throughout the past years. So we try to do a number of these each year, and we always welcome your suggestions. And at the conclusion of the webinar, we will have contact information for you to send us any suggestions for future webinars, things that you might find helpful. I'm also joined today by two colleagues from our communications department. Mona Shatters, our Director of Communications, and Amy Ketterer both have helped with this presentation and will be assisting throughout. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the webinar, and you should see a chat box, Q&A box there on the webinar. That exists for you to type in your questions. So we will be addressing as many of those questions as we can at the end of the webinar. So as we go through, feel free to type any questions you have in that box, and we will be monitoring those as we go, and we'll try to address as many as we can. If we can't get to your questions today, we do capture those questions, and we will respond to you via email following the webinar if we are unable to address your question during this time. Without further ado, I will jump into today's topic. I always like to remind our community of the mission of the SRTR. This is what we exist to do, to provide advanced statistical and epidemiological analyses related to solid organ allocation and transplantation in support of the Department of Health and Human Services and its agents in their oversight of the National Organ Transplantation System. So there's lots of data and analytics that we provide both to HRSA directly and to the OPTN, the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network, as they operate the nation's transplant system. Here's what we're hoping to cover on today's webinar. I will give you a brief background of the SRTR risk adjustment models. I will turn it over to Dr. Salkowski to go through some of his thoughts on the post-transplant outcomes risk adjustment models. And then Dr. Way will present some thoughts on the pre-transplant outcomes models. And so post-transplant outcomes are things in patient and graft survival. Pre-transplant outcomes include waitlist mortality, transplant rate, overall survival following listing, these types of things. We also have risk adjustment models for organ offer acceptance. Those will not be covered in detail today, but some of the same principles that we will be covering today apply to those models as well. So obviously we can't touch on all of the models. I'll give you some sense of the breadth of the models that the SRTR manages as we go through. As we begin, I recognize some folks are still joining the webinar today, but we do like to capture some sense of who the audience is. And so you should see a polling question appear on your screen here, and we're just simply asking you to pick the best option that best describes how you are related to the field of transplantation. So things like you're actually a transplant physician or surgeon, you're some other transplant professional, for example, administrator, quality nurse, social worker, pharmacist. You may be a patient or a family member of a patient, perhaps a living donor, organ procurement organization personnel, deceased donor family member, researcher, or other. So if you could just choose the best that fits you. This just helps us get a sense of if we're meeting if we're reaching the audience that we think we're reaching, and it helps us to do some future planning. So I appreciate you filling out that poll. It looks like the results are showing here. So we have 58% are other transplant professionals. So that's unsurprising. That's typically the audience that we're meeting with these webinars. So appreciate you taking the time to take that poll. Secondarily, we do recognize that people are listening perhaps with a room of colleagues, and so we're trying to just capture a sense as we do our tracking of how many folks we were able to reach with the webinar during our live webinars. And so if you could just indicate if it's just you listening in today, or you're perhaps in a room with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 more other colleagues with you. Simply gives us a sense of if our platform is meeting the needs of our audience and how many we may be reaching. Obviously, as we post videos to YouTube, and we can see how many people are able to watch those videos later on, but this gives us a sense of how many are listening in today. And I do see that the participant list is still trending upwards, so we might not capture everybody here, but hopefully this will give us a sense. So most are, I'd say a higher proportion this time around are just yourself listening in, which coincides probably with many of us perhaps working remotely during the COVID pandemic. So thanks again for taking those polls. And we'll just jump right into the substance of the webinar today. All that we do is guided by contractual requirements through our contract with HRSA. And so the focus of today's webinar is, of course, our risk adjustment models, which are used to risk adjust all of the performance metrics that we calculate for transplant programs and OPOs. This webinar is focusing today on the transplant program models. Many of the same concepts apply in the OPO models, the models, for example, for organ yield. We have covered those models on a previous webinar, so if you're interested in the OPO models, would point you to our YouTube channel or our website where those webinars are posted. So specifically in the SRTR contract, it is within task 3.9.1 where it mentions that we shall develop program-specific reports, abbreviated as PSRs here, on the performance of transplant programs and organ procurement organizations. And those post-transplant outcomes include risk-adjusted information for graft and patient survival following transplant. And that the contractor shall post the reporting schedule, the risk adjustment models, and a description of the technical methods on our website. And we'll be showing you some parts of our website where that information is posted, just so you have a reference where you can find this information. And I'll be just leading off today with some examples of why we want to really think about risk adjustment. How does it help us when we do these performance assessments? And just to give you a breadth of the risk adjustment models that we currently include, I've listed here 3 broad categories of risk adjustment models for the transplant programs. We have pre-transplant models. These cover things like waitlist mortality, the transplant rate, specifically for organs that have a deceased donor component. In addition to a living donor component, we do calculate a deceased donor transplant rate. And then we have an overall survival from listing set of models. Those are new as of this year. And then we do look at organ offer acceptance as well. On the post-transplant side, we do estimate 1 month, 1 year, and 3-year patient and graft survival. 68 models make up that suite of models for post-transplant outcomes. And then for the deceased organ donation side, for the OPOs, we have an eligible death conversion model as well as 6 models for deceased donor organ yield. So when you add all of these models up, we have currently 135 models that are updated every 6 months. And so I think it's always interesting to me to add that up, because we report a lot of data in these reports, and many different looks at the data, looks at different outcomes, and when you add all that together, it really does add up to a lot of models that we're producing every 6 months. And again, those are updated every 6 months as the cohorts evolve so that the models and the coefficients keep track with current practice. We do update all of those every 6 months, and they are all available on our website. And here is an image of where you can find them. If you go to our homepage at www.srtr.org and you click on the Reports and Tools dropdown, you will see a subcategory there of the risk adjustment models. And here you can see these broad categories of models for post-transplant outcomes, for waiting list models, for offer acceptance, for deceased donor yield for the OPOs, and for the new set of models that were released this year for mortality after lifting. And if you're not familiar with those models, we're not going to talk much about those today, but would encourage you, those appeared in the reports for the first time this year. And that's I like to call it an intent to treat assessment of the mortality experience post-listing. So it's sort of an intent to treat once a patient is listed. What was their overall survival experience, whether they were transplanted or not? It includes all experience post-transplant, not just a pre-transplant mortality. So here's where you can find those models. And if you're interested in much more technical detail about how we develop these models, more detail than we'll be able to give you on today's webinar, I will just point you to this publication that was published in Transplantation in 2016. In this publication, you can find much more technical detail about how these models are developed, the process that we go through. We do have a standardized documented process that chooses which risk factors appear in the models, how they appear in the models. And so that technical detail is there. But again, that's above and beyond what we will cover today, but just want to make the audience aware that that paper exists. And you can find that paper on the SRTR website within the publication sections. There, if you just do a search for that title there, you will find a PDF of this paper so that we make that conveniently available to you. Okay, so why risk adjust? This is a complex topic, and the models are complex. You know, we try to build the best models we can given the information that we have available to us within the OPTN system. And I think the key question to step back from all of that technical detail is to just simply ask ourselves, why are we doing this? And the simple answer, as I like to put it, is we're trying to, anytime we're looking at a performance metric, whether it be for an OPO, whether it be for a transplant program, or any type of metric where you're comparing entity A to entity B, perhaps, we're trying to make a decision based on that information. We're trying to draw a conclusion based on that information. And in this example I will focus on, say we're trying to draw a conclusion about, is program A's experience post-transplant, or their survival experience, better than program B's? I mean, I think that's ultimately what all of these performance metrics are trying to do, is we're trying to look at all the different transplant programs, organ programs within the system, and draw some conclusion about which ones are appearing to have better outcomes than others. And so I just give a simple example here where we have program A, who on its surface has a survival post-transplant. Let's just, for the sake of argument, say that this is a heart transplant program here, and this program has, or we'll go with kidney, 95% post-transplant first-year graft survival, let's say, at the kidney program. And then we have program B, and it has an 85% post-transplant one-year graft survival. And the sort of initial reaction might be that I'm going to go toward program A because they have a 10% higher first-year overall survival. And that's a natural reaction, and we're often asked the question, why can't we just go with observed survival and use that as the metric of good performance or poor performance? And I think just to illustrate why we may not want to do that, we do actually report overall survival at the programs, but is that a good idea to use that type of a metric for program evaluation? So now, let's say we are able to find a bit more data about these programs, and we first look at what is the average age of the recipients across these two programs. And here you see that the average age at program A is 15 years younger than the average age of the recipients at program B. So the average age at program A is 40, and the average recipient age at program B is 55. And then so now we're sort of confused, right? We may scratch our head and say, well, okay, this is perhaps not an apples to apples comparison here, because it appears that program A's population, whether by their choice or just by the nature of the need within their area, have younger people that they're transplanting that we may expect to have better post-transplant outcomes, compared to program B, which is serving perhaps an older population or is perhaps willing to list older recipients, willing to transplant older recipients. And so now we're sort of questioning our decision. It's hard to say, well, if I go to program A or program B, which might be a better outcome for me. And if I dig a bit further into the data, we know that kidneys are scored by a KDPI. Just as an example, lower is better. So if we look at the average KDPI here, program A has a 25% average KDPI, indicating that they are using donor kidneys with relatively good characteristics. And then we look at program B, who has an average KDPI of 75%, which are more toward the lower quality end of the scoring system for deceased donor kidneys. And again, we're confused, right? We think, okay, so program B is serving an older population. They are taking, whether by choice or by availability to them, kidneys with a lower quality profile than kidney program A. And so again, it makes it hard to draw conclusions. So the whole purpose of risk adjustment is not to look at the raw survival percentages across the program, but then dig into all of the information we know about the donors and the recipients of those programs. And that's specifically the purpose of the risk adjustment models. They do that mathematically by taking not just the age into account, but not just the KDPI into account, but lots of characteristics as available to us from the OPTN data collection system. Our modeling process looks through all of that information and tries to build the best predictive model we can. And the result of that is basically moves us into this world of, okay, we can observe outcomes at the program, but we have to compare that to what we expected. Okay, so this whole notion of observed to expected is really the realm that we must live in when we are trying to compare two different transplant programs. Okay, because here, if we derived an expected outcome at program A and an expected outcome at program B, it may be the case that program B is actually doing better with what they have than program A is, and the raw survival percentage would sort of lead us to the wrong conclusion that I myself might have a better outcome if I get transplanted at program A. And so this is really the motivation behind why we risk adjust and why the SRTR contract calls for us to risk adjust these outcomes. And so just to summarize some of those points that I just went through, the SRTR recognizes, and I would hope the community also recognizes, that some programs do have more acute patients than other programs, whether that's by choice or just by the nature of the patients they serve. Some programs do use lower quality donors, for example, more use of DCD donors or more willingness to use older donors, or perhaps increased infectious risk donors, or whatever sort of more marginal organs that they're willing to take. We also recognize that if we look at unadjusted outcomes metrics, it may simply reflect the risk tolerance of programs and not reflect the quality of care provided to their patients. And what I mean by that is programs that are willing to take on the riskier patients and willing to do the lower quality organs for the benefit of their patients may indeed have a lower unadjusted survival. But when you take into account the risk on both the recipient side and the donor side, they may actually look better than other programs that are not taking on that type of risk. So that's one of the reasons. I think that's perhaps the key reason that we want to do the risk adjustment. Finally, we recognize that programs may avoid riskier transplants if that risk is not adjusted for in the evaluations. Part of the reason we try to make all of the risk adjustments that we can is to give the community a sense of knowing that that is accounted for in the model, that if I use that DCD donor that is not automatically going to count against my program because I may have worse outcomes. The models take into account the fact that that is a DCD donor. And so we try to include all that actually improves our risk prediction so that programs are feel more confident in using the organs and taking the recipients they feel could benefit from transplantation. So given all that, we recognize that observed outcomes must be compared to expected outcomes, and risk adjustment models are used to derive those expected outcomes. And with that background, I am going to turn it to my colleague, Dr. Salkowski, who is going to walk through his notes on the post-transplant outcomes models. Nick.
Thanks. Now, I'm going to talk about the post-transplant outcomes models, and I'm going to see, I'm now the presenter. Excellent. So basically, when I'm talking about the risk adjustment models for post-transplant, there are models that have two different outcomes. One outcome is all-cause graft failure, that is a graft failure or a death, and the other is patient death. And there are two follow-up time periods. There's a 1-year post-transplant model that we also use for the 1-month outcomes in the PSRs. And there's also a 3-year post-trans model. Now, all of these models are built as lasso-penalized proportional hazards regression models. Now, I'm going to try to avoid as much math as I can here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. So they're penalized models. Now, unpenalized models are sort of the normal sort of models that you may have been exposed to in a statistics class or something like that. And unpenalized models try to find the parameters that best fit the data. Now, this sounds great, but it can lead to overfitting. That is, your model is sort of fitting your data too well so the idiosyncrasies of your data set get captured in the model. And when you fit the data too well, the model doesn't do a great job of predicting because the model is capturing things that are kind of the weird coincidences of your data and are not a real thing that matters. So when we fit a panelized model, what we're doing is we're looking for a model that balances out fitting the data well and minimizing some sort of penalty. And in this case, a lasso penalty has to do with the parameters in the model, and we want to try to find small effects. So we're trying to not have things in the model that have really big effects on the risk, but that they still fit the data really pretty well. Now, there are also proportional hazards regression models. Proportional hazards regression models are really common in survival analyses in medicine. They directly predict the hazard, and the hazard is the rate that events occur. Now, so each predictor in the model has a proportional or kind of multiplicative effect on the hazard, and the hazard is mathematically linked to survival. So when we predict the hazard, we're also indirectly predicting the survival, right? Because how long it takes for an event to occur is related to the rate that events occur. Now, every part of the program evaluations is related to the observed events and the expected events. And when I'm talking about events, I'm talking about graft failures or deaths in the post-transplant world. So the observed events are basically the number of graft failures or deaths that occur in a program. Okay. The expected events are coming from this risk adjustment model. It's a kind of a prediction of how many events do we think would be we'd expect to have at your program given the donors and the recipients at your program. Okay? So we're using this model to predict the expected events. And then every part of the evaluation is related to the observed events and the expected events. Now, the easiest sort of way to sort of look at the observed and the expected might be to look at the observed to expected ratio, that is the observed events divided by the expected events, right? And in the past, the SRTR produced this for the PSRs, and it's not a horrible thing to look at, but it has some pretty big weaknesses. And the biggest weakness for it is that small programs often have 0 observed events. They have no graft failures, they have no deaths because they only performed a small number of transplants. And when you look at the observed to expected ratio, when observed is 0, the observed to expected ratio is 0. 0 divided by something is 0. Now, that is, in some sense, the estimate that best fits the data, right? Because you had 0 events in real life. But it's kind of a silly estimate for what the actual risk is at a program. I mean, no matter how amazing your program may be, getting a transplant doesn't make your recipients immortal, right? There is a real non-zero risk of death or graft failure, no matter how great your program is. And so an estimate of 0 for the effect of your program on risk is a pretty silly estimate. We know that's not right. So instead, we use what's called a shrinkage estimator. And what a shrinkage estimator is doing is it's pulling that observed to expected ratio toward some other number. In this case, the other number is 1. Now, 1 would be sort of the average for a program. Like a normal program, a typical program would have an observed to expected ratio of 1, would have a hazard ratio of 1. So the way that we do this mathematically, and there are complicated statistical justifications for why we use this particular formula, but the formula itself is not particularly complicated. We take the number of observed events and add 2 to it, and then we divide that by the number of expected events and add 2 to it, right? So this usually produces more reasonable estimates, okay? So we can look at an example here, right? So for a smaller program, suppose we observe 1 graft failure, and we expected 0.5 graft failures, okay? So the ODE ratio in this case would be 2.0. We have twice as many graft failures as we expect, but we're going to do shrinkage, right? Our hazard ratio, we're going to take the 1 observed and add 2 to it to make 3. We have a 0.5 expected graft failures. We're going to add 2 to that to get 2.5. And 3 divided by 2.5 is 1.2. So we have taken that 2.0 and we have shrunk it toward 1. So it's still greater than 1 because there are more graft failures than expected. But it's not at 2. It's in between 1 and 2, and we've shrunk it a fair amount towards 1. And we're doing a lot of shrinkage because there's not a whole lot of data here. It's a small program. They only did a small number of transplants probably. And so we really don't have a good way to tell whether or not that 1 graft failure was because there's a problem at this program, or that 1 graft failure is because there was just some bad luck and that graft failed for reasons that were completely unrelated to the quality of care at that program, because bad luck and random stuff happens. Now, if we have a larger program, let's say you have 10 observed graft failures, but we expected 5. Again, the ODE ratio would be 2.0. But when we do our shrinkage estimate with our hazard ratio, we add 2 to 10 to get 12. We add 2 to 5 to get 7. We do the division, we end up with 1.71. So we've shrunken that 2.0 toward 1, but we've shrunk it less than for the small program. And we're shrinking it less because we know more about the large program than we know about the small program, right? So that we can rely more on the observed data for a large program because there's more of it. And it's less likely that there are 5 excess graft failures because of bad luck at a large program than if there was sort of 0.5 excess graft failures because of bad luck at a small program. So that's the way the shrinkage and the hazard ratio work. Now, if you want to get a sort of better looking evaluation, you need to get your hazard ratio lower. Now, if you look at that formula for the hazard ratio, it's fairly straightforward mathematically how you would get a lower hazard ratio. You either have to reduce the number of observed events so that the numerator of that ratio goes down, or you can increase the number of expected events so that the denominator goes up, or you can do both of those things. Now, there are some fairly obvious ways to do those 2 things. Now, if you want to reduce the observed events, one thing that you could do is to improve graft and patient survival somehow, okay? Because if you improve graft and patient survival, you will have fewer events. Now, that will also increase your expected events. Now, this is a bit more subtle about why that would happen. But the reason that happens is that the number of expected events is a function of how long your grafts and your patients survive, right? If you have a graft fail in day 7, right, that counts as a graft failure. If you have a graft that fails on day 360, that also counts as a graft failure and you're observed. But we expect more grafts to fail over the course of 360 days than over the course of 7 days. So the longer your grafts and your patients can survive, the more expected events we will predict for your program. So anytime you can get grafts and patients to survive longer, that increases your expected events. So improving graft and patient survival is the #1 way on this list to lower your hazard ratio and look better. Now, if you look only at reducing the observed events, there are a couple other ways you could reduce your number of observed events. One would be to perform fewer transplants, right? Generally, if you perform fewer transplants, you'll have fewer graft failures and deaths. Or you could also perform less risky transplants. Generally, the less risky transplants have fewer graft failures and fewer deaths. And those two things would tend to reduce your observed events. Now, on the expected event side, if you want to increase your expected events, you could perform more transplants, right? The more transplants you perform, the more graft failures and deaths we will expect. Or you can perform riskier transplants. If you perform riskier transplants, we will predict more graft failures and more deaths, right? And you can see that the number 2 and 3 things on this list are in opposition to each other, right? So that if you are trying to lower your hazard ratio by performing fewer transplants or performing less risky transplants, you may reduce your observed events, but you'll also reduce your expected events. And so it is not at all clear that that will make your hazard ratio go down, right? Because you're making the top part and the bottom part go down. Similarly, if you perform more transplants or perform riskier transplants, that will tend to increase your observed events, but it'll also tend to increase your expected events. So there's no clear indication that this will make you look worse if you take on more risk or do more transplants, right? So what was left is that #1 thing, improving graft and patient survival. If you can do those two, if you can do that, then it will reduce your observed events and increase your expected events, and without a real trade-off there. Everything else is a balancing act, and there's no clear-cut way to say whether it's going to make anything look better or worse. Another way that you can make your expected events increase is to submit complete and accurate data to the OPTN, right? Because the SRTR treats missing data as low risk. So when we do your prediction for your expected events, when we predict the expected events, if you have missing data that's part of that risk adjustment model, we are going to treat missing data as being low risk, okay? Now, what that means is that if you know, if data is missing and you truly don't know what the value is, obviously the correct thing to do is to leave the data missing because you just don't know what the value of that data ought to be. But sometimes data is left missing, but it is in your records. You can find out what the value ought to be. And if you can fill that in so that the data is no longer missing and as accurately represents your candidates or your recipients, then data will no longer be missing. And it's possible that the true value of that data will be higher risk than the missing value. And the way that the calculation works is it can't be lower risk than the missing value. The missing value is set to the lowest risk possible, right? So if you fill in missing data with accurate data for your program, it will tend to increase the number of expected events for your program. So this is sort of one of the key questions is like, does avoiding risk work? And so in order to discuss this question, there are 2 different kinds of risk factors. There are adjusted risk factors and there are unadjusted risks, okay? So adjusted risk factors are the risk factors that are included in the models, right? If it's in the model and you're taking on that risk, it's going to be adjusted for in the model. And avoiding risks that are in the models shouldn't really have much of an effect on your evaluation, right? Because if you took on those risks, we'd adjust for it. Your expected number of events would go up. And even if you have more observed events, the expected events in the model should take care of that. However, there are other there may be unadjusted risk factors, things that aren't included in the models. Now, and if you manage to avoid these risks because they're not in the models, maybe that would make your program look better. Now, it's also there's a very special thing about the unadjusted risk factors, right? And I've been talking about whether it's in the model or not, but in general, what that means is it collected by the OPTN or not? Because when we build these models, we are generally looking at almost all of the risk factors that are available to us in the OPTN data set. So if something is a risk factor, right, it'll end up in the model, right? But if we're looking to see if the other things predict risk as well. So if it's collected by the OPTN, but it's not part of the model, it probably means that we looked to see whether it predicted outcomes, and we found that it didn't, right? So if it doesn't predict the outcomes, if it doesn't predict risk, it's not really a risk factor, right? Or alternatively, it's a risk factor, but it's so strongly correlated with something that is in the model that we've captured it with some other factor in the model. So when you're talking about unadjusted risk factors, we're generally talking about stuff that the OPTN doesn't even collect. So you, as a transplant program, may know more about your patients than the OPTN does. And if you know about something the OPTN doesn't know about, that is a potential unadjusted risk factor. So another thing to talk about here is what we're calling the risk and reward. Right now, remember that the hazard ratio is observed plus 2 divided by expected plus 2. So if observed and expected are both close to 0, right, the hazard ratio will be close to 1, right? Because observed plus 2 is be about 2 when observed is close to 0, and expected plus 2 will be about 2 when expected is close to 0, and about 2 divided by about 2 is about 1, right? So if we look at sort of a small-ish program or a fairly small program with a low expected number of events, in this case 0.2 events, right? Now, the best possible outcome for this program that has a low expected number of events would be to have 0 observed events. That's the best any program can do, right? But because of shrinkage and the fact that there's very little data for what is probably a very small program, right? Even in the best case scenario here, this program would end up with a hazard ratio of 0.91, which is better than expected, but not dramatically better than expected, and would end up in tier 4. If they start having 1 event, right, that's a bit worse than expected. Their hazard ratio would go to 1.36, and they'd end up in tier 3. If they have a lot of bad luck, they could end up in tier 2 or even tier 3, because the limit on the number of observed events, you can't do better than 0, right? But the limit on how badly you can do would be the number of transplants you perform, right? So when you see this, if you have a very small number of expected events because you're doing a small number of transplants or you're not doing risky transplants, there's a real limit to how good your evaluation can get. But if you have some bad luck along the way, your evaluation could look fairly bad. Now, in contrast, if you have a higher expected, in this case, the expected is 5.0, so this is a fairly big program, you can kind of see that not only can you get to tier 5 if you have notably better than expected outcomes, right? But a little bit of bad luck, say, 1 extra graft failure or something like that, doesn't dramatically affect where your evaluation ends up, right? Because we're looking here at observed of 2 and then 4 and then 6 and then 8. It takes a lot more sort of, of graft failures in order to move the evaluation because there's so much more information about a larger program. So which risks are adjusted? You can take a look at the risk adjustment models, including the predictors that are on the SRTR website. And I am going to try to share the screen here with the live SRTR website right now. And you can see here on our app, you can choose the SRTR release date, the PSR release date. You can choose what sort of organ you're interested in, whether it's grafted patient survival, adult or pediatric survival, whether you're interested in if it has a, I just clicked on kidney to get deceased donor and living donor, and first-year outcomes and 3-year outcomes. And then below here, you can see that there are a bunch of tabs. One is the model elements. This is just a list of stuff that is in the model. There are model coefficients, and they are the actual effects that are in the model. In this case, you can see that we have each model element and how it affects the model. We have things that are called spline terms that I will show you how they work in just a moment. And basically what they do is they let the effect change at various points. So in this case, it's albumin. The effect of albumin changes at a value of 3 or 3.2 or 4.4 or 4.6 or 4. The easiest way to look at the effects of these models is to look at these model element plots. And I will show you albumin here, the candidate total albumin. And you can see that in this case, low values of candidate albumin are higher risk. The risk keeps going down until you get to 3.2, which is one of our points in our spline, and then the slope changes a bit. It changes a bit again at 4, and then again at 4.6. So this is basically showing the effect of candidate albumin on, in this case, deceased donor 1-year kidney graft survival. There is also the based on cumulative hazard, which is useful if you're trying to do some sort of calculations on your own. And there's also an other elements tab that describes the things that are also in the model that were not found to predict the outcomes in this particular cycle. So in this case, donor age was not found to be predictive. Now, that doesn't mean that donor age doesn't matter, because in the model, for these kidneys, right, there's the donor risk index is in the model as well. And so the fact that donor age is not in the model right now just means that we don't find there's an effective donor age that's separate from the effective donor age through the KDRI. Okay. There's one other tab that's additional information that just talks about how some of the things are calculated here. And that is what I have here. For that, I'm going to stop sharing that. And I'm going to let Andrew Way continue in just a moment as I pass his presenter privileges to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. So I'll be talking about the pre-transplant outcomes that the SRTR maintains, and I'm going to try to go through this pretty quickly because I'm aware of the time and we want some time for the Q&A. So when we talk about waiting list models or pre-transplant models with an SRTR, we're usually talking about the overall transplant, deceased donor transplant, and waitlist mortality rate models. These models, in terms of calculating the program-specific evaluation, use a very similar process as the post-transplant models. They just have different outcomes. So I'm going to skip a lot of the technical detail from Nick's presentation because it's essentially the same for the waiting list models. But instead, I'm going to focus on the differences in the model documentation app and some ways you can use it to maybe understand the models a little bit. So this is the landing page for the waiting list model documentation. And you just need to select an organ, outcome, and age group. It's important to point out the outcome does depend on the organ you selected. So kidney and liver are going to have outcomes that include living donors, whereas the other organs will not. And the lung models have different pediatric age groups due to the different allocation systems that are used in lung transplant. So just below, after you select your organ of interest, there's these 5 tabs at the bottom. And the first tab is this Model Elements tab. And if you click on that, it's going to list each of the variables included in the waiting list model that you've selected. But what's sort of really useful about this particular page is the source column, where it says TCR, calculated status history. This is essentially describing where in the OPTN database the SRTR is getting this particular risk factor. And so if you want to know where it's coming from, you can look here. There are acronyms and possibly things that are a little bit terminology within the transplant community. So you might ask what they mean. So to understand what these acronyms mean, there's this additional info tab on the far right among those 5 tabs. And if you click on that, you will see this information. And so down here is the data sources section of the additional information tab, and it describes what each of those sources mean. So the TCR corresponds to the transplant candidate registration form. This is the source for most variables in the waiting list models. However, we do get a fair amount of information for the liver and lung models from the status history files, which are typically used in allocation. Basically, MELD and LAS have a lot of useful clinical information for the potential outcomes of patients on the waiting list. We also have some external data sources in some situations. This is a little bit more rare. For example, the TCR USRDS will indicate a variable that is derived from information from the TCR, but also the USRDS, the United States Renal Data System database. And some other variables are calculated, and this just means it's basically some function of a different variable in the database. So the best example here is BMI, which just depends on height and weight. But another possible example is EGFR. I'm not sure if EGFR is actually included in any of the models. I think creatinine might be. But that would be another example of a possibly calculated variable. It's important to point out that the additional info tab does include other useful information. For example, CPRA has different collection policies depending on when the candidate was listed, and that's described there, as well as how multi-organ candidates and candidates multiple listings are described. Also below this section in the additional info tab is some more, I would say, detailed information. I don't think this information is really necessary for sort of conceptually understanding how the models work, but if you want to calculate the expected for a lot of patients, you're going to need these variables because they essentially need these files because they essentially specify the outer limits for continuous variables, which is pretty technical and really more of a detailed point. So now you know where the elements come from. The question is, what is the association of these elements with the actual outcomes that we're including, like transplant rate and waitlist mortality? So you can use the model coefficients tab or the model elements tab. The model coefficients tab is basically a large table, which can be pretty difficult to conceptualize different effects. I do want to point out that the download CSV file can be useful if you want to do some of your own types of presentations of the different effects of, for example, age on waitlist mortality. However, I think Model Elements tab provides a much more intuitive way to present each of the effects of the risk factors on the outcome of interest. So in this example, we've selected candidate age at listing, and it gives us the effective candidate age. So currently the kidney waitlist model is selected, so you can see that essentially older candidates at listing had a higher hazard of waitlist mortality than younger candidates, which is not surprising at all. But if we look at the deceased donor transplant rate, we can see that candidate age has very little association with the deceased donor transplant rate. Keep in mind that this hazard ratio, I just want to point this out. The use of the term hazard ratio is more the term used within the statistics community, and it's not implying any sort of negative or positive connotation, right? Higher transplant rates are good, so a higher hazard of deceased donor transplant is good. So that's just something to keep in mind. I also want to quickly point out that there are situations when we don't estimate risk adjustment models. This can happen for two reasons. The first reason is that we tried to find predictive risk factors, but were unable to. And the model documentation app will show you when that happens. So the example on the screen right now is the lung transplant rate model for pediatric candidates between 12 and 18 years old. The second reason we won't have a risk adjustment model is that there were not enough events to try to find any predictive risk factors. And so an example of that is also on the screen. It's the lung waitlist mortality model for pediatric candidates less than 12 years old. And there were fewer than 25 events when we tried to build the risk adjustment model. I also want to point out that there are other tools for programs to sort of analyze the effect of these risk adjustment models. So we have expected workbooks on the SRTR secure site, which have patient-level data and built-in subgroup analyses, and these can provide a little bit more of a hands-on approach for understanding both the effect of risk adjustment, the specific way expected is calculated, as well as the outcomes of different types of patients. And we did have a webinar on the pre-transplant expected workbooks in May, and that's available on the SRTR website. And I also want to emphasize that we also recently released new models for patient mortality after listing. These models capture both the effect of both pre-transplant and post-transplant outcomes and have similar documentation on the SRTR website, along with expected workbooks on the SRTR secure site. We just decided not to include them in this particular webinar due to time constraints and some notable differences in how the models are constructed compared to the waitlist and post-transplant models. And with that, I will turn it over to Amy, I believe, for the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Way, and thank you to our other presenters, Dr. Snyder and Dr. Sulkowski today. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today. I hope it has been very educational for you, and you can look forward to having more of these webinars in the future. And don't forget that we will be putting this webinar up on our YouTube channel after this presentation is over. It'll be a little while. It takes some time to load, but it will be there for you. And you can find other previous webinars as well as many educational materials on our website, our YouTube channel as well. So to get to our questions today, since we do have quite a bit to go through and quite fewer minutes to get through them than usual, so I do apologize if we cannot get to your email or to your question. We will definitely email it to you afterwards. So I have parsed these into questions for the various presenters, and I want to start with Dr. Snyder. We have a question. Will anyone address this question? Is there any such thing as too much risk adjustment? Too much risk adjustment to motivate and incentivize riskier program behavior in terms of both donor and recipient selection that can be okay for the program, but maybe not for stewardship of limited organs?
That's a good question. That question has come to us before. It really speaks to, what are risks that should be adjusted and what are risks that should not perhaps be adjusted for in the model. And when questions, I can just say that the factors we include in the model go through a process, right? We go through all of the data that's collected by the OPTN that has that's available to us to include in these models. And we scrutinize through all of that as part of our model building process. And when certain factors come to our attention, whether that be just through our internal findings or external people that email us questions about the risk adjustment models, we do occasionally bring factors to our visiting committee, which is our external advisory panel. There's been examples of this in the recent past where somebody wants, so risk factor X, say, taken into account in the model. That's not there. And it might not be there because we've looked at it and it wasn't predictive, or perhaps it's categorized together with some other factor and somebody feels it should be split out. It's there's definitely some art to this as well, I will say. And so when we have questions like that should this be adjusted for or not, we take that to our expert panel, our advisory committee, and get their opinion on it. And as much as we can, we rely on the community to tell us what are those things that should be there and what are the things that perhaps shouldn't. And so I would always encourage people, that is our process. If you have recommendations for what makes the model better or might make it worse, just let us know, and we bring those things to our visiting committee that meets quarterly, and we review those. So that's a regular part of our process.
Thank you, Dr. Snyder. For our next question, I'm actually going to hand this one over to Dr. Salkowski. The question was, what is, as a rule of thumb, considered a small program or number?
Well, for me, the issue is not the number of transplants that you perform, it's the number of expected events at your program, right? And so, I mean, we don't really have a small program dividing line at SRTR. But basically, I mean, the fewer expected events your program has, the smaller it is. So, I mean, I don't want to categorize programs that way, but it's because it's a spectrum.
Thank you, Dr. Salkowski.
But clearly, if you have fewer than one expected event, you're fairly small.
Right. Thank you very much. And also for you, Dr. Salkowski, how is a factor of 2 arrived at for the shrinkage?
Well, it has to do with, I mean, the technical answer is that it comes from a conjugate prior Bayesian analysis. So what we have is if a prior, in this case, if the prior is a gamma 2-2 distribution, and that's where the 2 comes from, more or less, how was 2 chosen? And frankly, we considered possibilities, and 2 seemed to be about the right balance between having too much shrinkage and not enough shrinkage. I can't give you a strong answer for why it's 2 instead of 1.8 or 2.1 or even 1.5. But what we want to have is a situation where we don't have bizarrely extreme predictions or evaluations for small programs because we don't do enough shrinkage. And we don't want to have a situation where program outcomes are irrelevant because we have so much shrinkage, right? The bigger that number is, right? If it wasn't 2, if it were 200 instead or 2,000, right? Then transplant programs' actual outcomes would not matter very much. We would shrink everybody down to almost exactly 1, and everyone would look the same. So there are trade-offs, and certainly people can argue that it should be a bit higher or a bit lower, but the trade-off basically is if you have too much shrinkage, then program outcomes don't matter very much. If you have too little shrinkage, then the results aren't very stable. So,
Okay.
Nick, this is John. If I could just add to your response as well. You mentioned it, but yeah, when that was decided upon, I think it was 2012, 2013, we evaluated a number of options. And if you're familiar with, we do have a paper explaining the Bayesian approach, and so I'd encourage you to find that on our website as well, or email us so we can point you to it. But it describes the idea that the prior distribution that we're working off of in the Bayesian analysis is a gamma 2-2 distribution, as Dr. Salkowski mentioned. And one of the concepts there is that prior assumption really is telling us that we believe that the vast majority of program hazard ratios should lie sort of in the range of, say, 0.5 up to 1.5, or say 0.25 to 2, that it's going to be an unusual event that there are hazard ratios much outside those extremes. And so the shape of that gamma 2-2 distribution really captured that best, and ultimately our visiting committee recommended the use of that prior distribution, although we did investigate others.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we had a lot of questions, and we really weren't able to get to all of them, and we are up against the 3 o'clock hour now, and in respect for everyone's time, I want to make sure that we're paying attention to that. So I'm going to have to call this a day for us, and it seems like it was a very successful webinar. If we did not get to your questions, please do know we will get to it via email following this webinar. Thank you, everyone, for visiting us today, and I hope that you have learned something. And I want to remind you that if you are looking for some more information or looking for this webinar, you can certainly find it on our YouTube channel. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.